In part 1 of the series, I looked at what a GMO actually is and how it's created in the lab. This gives us a good information base with which to explore other avenues, and in part 2 I looked at some of the claims and the papers that the anti-GMO proponents pointed to as being proof of how unsafe GMOs are. In this part 3 I'll be looking at what the scientific consensus of GMO safety is and what that means. I'm Justin Harnish and this is Off My Block. When it comes to the proof that GMOs are unsafe, it's increasingly obvious to me that study after study is coming back inconclusive or flawed or a flat-out fraud. Some of them even go, at least in part, towards showing how safe the GMOs actually are. There are still 2 studies I haven't looked at which always seem to pop up.
The first is the effects of diets containing GM potatoes expressing Galanthus nivalis lectin on rats' small intestine. The abstract stated, diets containing genetically modified potatoes expressing the lectin Galanthus nivalis agglutinin, or GNA, had variable effects on different parts of the rat gastrointestinal tract. Some of the effects, such as the proliferation of the gastric mucosa, were mainly due to the expression of the GNA transgene. However, other parts of the construct or the genetic transformation, or both, could also have contributed to the overall biological effects of the GNA GM potatoes, particularly on the small intestine and cecum. The academics' review had this to say on that study. A panel of experts, the Royal Society and food safety scientists and regulatory agencies around the world, all have concluded that the study does not demonstrate that GM potatoes were unsafe in any way. Although Pustai travels around the globe fear-mongering about the dangers of GM crops, it is ironic that even if his study were correct, it would only prove that those specific potatoes were unsafe and not that all GM crops were unsafe, as he seems to be claiming. For the record, the potatoes in question were a research project. They were never submitted to regulators and they were never commercialized. The last study cited was a 3-generation study with genetically modified BT corn in rats. This study was, once more, inconclusive, and it said as much. It also doesn't seem to be peer-reviewed or in any reputable scientific journal. There are thousands of studies just like this which don't so much prove the safety of GMOs but rule out specific concerns and potential dangers associated with consuming GMOs. One of the WHO studies quotes, "The potential direct health effects of GM foods are generally comparable to the known risks associated with conventional foods and include, for example, the potential for allergenicity and toxicity of components present and the nutritional quality and microbiological safety of the food." They go on to say, a series of FAO, WHO expert consultations held in 2000, 2001 and 2003 recognized that animal studies can be of help, but that there are practical difficulties in obtaining meaningful information from conventional toxicology testing, especially with whole food studies in laboratory animals, where the appropriate animal diet is a factor that needs to be assured. The consultations also noted that very little is known about the potential long-term effects of any foods. At present, there is no conclusive information available on the possible health effects of modifications which would significantly change the nutritional characteristics of any food, such as nutritionally enhanced foods. It has been argued that random insertion of genes in GMOs may cause genetic and phenotypic instabilities, but as yet no clear scientific evidence for such effects is available. There are studies out there that presume to prove GMOs are unsafe, from the scientifically ridiculous, such as mutant genes finding their way into our own DNA, through to proof that pesticides are harmful to the human body, which is probably quite accurate, though nothing to do with GMOs themselves. I'll be looking into that claim in a later episode, because GMOs are resistant to pests and herbicides for a reason. I still can't find any studies or reports that conclusively prove that GMOs
are unsafe. Remember, we're not talking about the environmental or the economical impact of GMOs. We are for now just talking about the health risks involved with human consumption of GMOs. So what about the studies that prove GMOs are safe? Are there any? And what is the scientific consensus of GMO safety?
Scientific consensus is something either rigidly held onto or thrown out like yesterday's trash, depending if it agrees with your own view or not. If you take a skeptical approach, as I am in this series, which is to go where the evidence leads and perhaps even change my mind on something, then the scientific consensus is what you can rest your hat on as being the truth. Scientific consensus is the collective judgment, position, and opinion of the community of scientists in a particular field of study. Consensus implies general agreement, though not necessarily unanimity. You can never prove something to be safe. You can, however, rule out certain safety concerns by doing tests. An apple, whether organic, conventional, or GM, can still pose a health risk on some level even though we have yet to experience it. But it is universally recognized to be a safe and healthy food to consume. Well, unless you're allergic. It's kind of like GMOs are innocent until proven guilty. The claim is that they cause cancer or some such problem. The null hypothesis is that GMOs do not cause cancer. So if the evidence is not forthcoming to show that GMOs do in fact show some sort of correlation, then the null hypothesis is still the correct one. If a correlation is found, does that mean GMOs cause cancer? Well, not necessarily. The correlation has to be investigated and a causation found. Even with the correlation, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a connection, and the null hypothesis still stands. Any claim needs evidence. The question is, what is the scientific consensus on GMO safety? After debunking study after study that, quote-unquote, proves GMOs are unsafe, there is really only one fallback position that anti-GMO proponents have, and that is to claim that A, there is no scientific consensus as there is very little study done in the field of GM safety, and that current studies are inconclusive, and or B, the studies are done or funded by corporations which introduce a conflict of interest. Indeed, there are studies that fall under just that heading, which we've already looked into. Simply put, the assertion that all or most studies that show GMOs to be safe are funded by big agriculture or big pharma is a myth. Again, these studies show that GMOs are not causing harm. The myths are propagated by a book called Genetic Roulette. And it's ironic and somewhat hypocritical. What is good for the GM goose is good for the organic gander. The studies that cite the dangers of GMOs by anti-GMO proponents are funded by big organic, companies that stand to gain billions of dollars if the world goes organic. Also, perpetuating these myths and spreading fear guarantees people like Jeffrey Smith and other authors more book sales. But not only are there mountains of evidence, there is also a scientific consensus. The Genera website, or Genetic Engineering Risk Atlas, tackles the task of compiling peer-reviewed studies in the area of GM safety. Genera's mission is to be a searchable database of peer-reviewed research on the relative risks of genetically engineered crops that include important details at a glance. There are currently more than 2,000 peer-reviewed reports regarding GM safety in scientific literature, and Genera planned to compile 1,200 of these into its database. At the moment, they've done so with more than 400 randomly selected studies and found that half of GMO research is independent. The first thing to note is the pure number of peer-reviewed studies, which puts paid to the myth that there is not enough research done on the safety of GMOs. The second is that half of all studies are independent. The Genera press release says this: the results show that independent peer-reviewed research on GMOs is common, conducted worldwide, and makes up half of the total of all research on risks associated with genetic engineering. Out of the first 400 randomly selected studies available on the Genera beta test, half of them are funded entirely by government agencies and independent non-profit organizations. These include American Association of Advancement of Science, American Medical Association, World Health Organization, National Academy of Sciences, Royal Society of Medicine, European Commission, American Council on Science and Health, American Dietetic Association, American Society for Cell Biology, American Society for Microbiology, American Society for Plant Sciences, International Seed Foundation, CAST, Crop Science Society of America, Federation of Animal Science Societies, Society for In Vitro Biology, Society of Toxicology, French Academy of Science, Union of German Academies of Science and Humanities, International Council for Science, and many, many more. All these studies have come to the same conclusion, which is what makes a scientific consensus a scientific consensus. The AAAS says it like this: the World Health Organization, the American Medical Association, the US National Academy of Sciences, the British Royal Society, and every other respected organization that has examined the evidence has come to the same conclusion. Consuming foods containing ingredients derived from GM crops is no riskier than consuming the same foods containing ingredients from crop plants modified by conventional plant improvement techniques. 89% of scientists within the field accept that GMOs are safe. Compare this with 87% of environmental scientists that accept that global warming is, at least in part, due to human activity. This is an overwhelming consensus. Well, that's it for part 3. In part 4, we'll be investigating seed contamination. All the references I use, by the way, will be in the show notes, and if you'd like to leave a comment, please do so in the comment section below, or you can email me on offmyblock@mail.com. Well, thank you for watching, and I hope you got a bit out of it. If you did, please give me a big thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And remember, keep calm and garden on.